Es freut mich außerordentlich, Sie hier heute zu unserem Vortrag 50 Years of Animal Welfare von Professor David Fraser begrüßen zu dürfen. Mein Name ist Eva Perse, ich leite die Tierschutzombudsstelle Wien, eine Einrichtung, die primär die Aufgabe hat, die Interessen des Tierschutzes zu vertreten. Und für uns selber ist dieser Abend auch besonders interessant, weil wir ja auf 50 Jahre Tierschutzarbeit zurückblicken dürfen, und besonders spannend wird auch sein der Ausblick auf die Zukunft. Und in diesem Zusammenhang möchte ich mich ganz herzlich bei dir, lieber David, bei Professor David Fraser bedanken, der ohne Zögern zugesagt hat, heute diesen Vortrag zu halten. Und ein weiterer Dank gilt unserer Öffentlichkeitsarbeiterin, unserer Expertin für strategische Kommunikation, Frau Indra Klei, die heute moderieren wird und auch David kurz vorstellen wird. Ja, mein Bezug zu David, Sie haben es schon gemerkt, ich darf bei Du mit ihm sein, ist, dass ich ihn sehr lange kenne, auch seine Familie kenne. Und so habe ich mir erlaubt, seine Frau zu fragen, was sie denn glaubt, auf was David besonders stolz sei. Und sie hat Folgendes geantwortet. I think if you were to ask David what he's most proud of, he would quickly answer my students. Und die Antwort gefällt mir so gut. Der David ist so ein bescheidener Mensch und ich kann es nur bestätigen. Seine Arbeit, seine tollen Publikationen und auch sein Wirken, dass die Weitergabe seines Wissens an die Studentinnen, die überall in der ganzen Welt sitzen, macht einen Impact für den Tierschutz weltweit. Und auch unsere Arbeit hier in Wien für den Tierschutz wird davon beeinflusst. Ja. Und in diesem Sinne sehe ich uns heute auch als Studentinnen, als Studiosi, in der Wortbedeutung studiosus wissbegierig, und ich lade alle ein, auch interaktiv zu beteiligen. Das wird dann noch erklärt, wie das möglich ist. Ich bedanke mich ganz herzlich bei David nochmal, und wer heute nicht fragen möchte, kann auch über andere Kanäle mit uns in Kontakt treten. Das möchte ich noch kurz sagen. Wir haben eine Homepage, wir haben einen Facebook-Auftritt und auch einen Newsletter. So wünsche ich uns heute einen tollen, spannenden Abend und übergebe jetzt die Moderation an Indra.
So, we do not only switch seats, but also languages. So I will continue in English now. Hello, David. Nice to see you. Thank you, Eva, for this quick introduction. So before we get to the main part of today's online event, I would like to give you some quick information on the technical part. So David Fraser's lecture, as you all know, will be held in English and without a presentation. So don't panic if you don't see any slides. This is on purpose. David provided a summary for us about his lecture that will be available on our website, tieranwalt.at, from tomorrow on. And after this talk, like Eva mentioned already, we will have the opportunity to discuss some questions or to discuss about the topics that David raised. So if you have any questions or thoughts that you would like to share with us, please post them into the chat. And please also let us know if you would like to post the questions yourself or if we should read it out to David. So both ways are possible. So that's it for the technical part. Unlike Eva, I never had the chance to meet David in person, but I will still do my very best to introduce our guest and speaker, Professor David Fraser. Sometimes I have to look at my notes because it is impossible to learn like the main steps and milestones of his career by heart. So sometimes I have to check my notes. David Fraser marks a very special anniversary this year because it has been 50 years since he entered the field of animal welfare science. Back in 1971, he started his first job at the Edinburgh School of Agriculture, where he did research on the welfare of pigs. Please correct me whenever I say anything wrong, okay? I hope it's all good. So his interest in animals started much earlier, though. David spent his childhood on a farm in southern Ontario. And I'm not sure about it. I haven't read it anywhere, but I can imagine that this environment and the first-hand experience in these early years had a strong impact on his career choice and also on his ongoing interest in animals and their welfare. So after his start in farm animal research, David Fraser focused on a very Canadian topic, I have to say, for a while, which was the behavior and management of moose before he got back into farm animal welfare and behavior at the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa. After 16 years on the farm, back in 1997, he joined the University of British Columbia as professor in the animal welfare program, and he is still in that position today. So in addition to his academic career, David has worked with many organizations. He was, for example, one of the original members of the Animal Welfare Working Group of the World Organization for Animal Health in Paris. He chaired the expert consultation. I have to read that now, I'm sorry. He chaired the expert consultation on animal welfare of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. He led the development of the National Strategy for Farm Animal Welfare in Canada, and he served on many, many, many more advisory committees all over the world. David was also appointed member of the Order of Canada in 2005 for his work as a pioneer in the field of animal welfare science, and we are very, very proud to welcome this pioneer, Professor David Fraser, for this very, very special and very personal online lecture today. His personal reflection on past, present, and future changes and challenges in animal welfare. So, David, the screen is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sehr vielen Dank, Indra und Eva. Guten Morgen hier in Vancouver. Guten Abend dort in Wien. And now I switch to the language of Shakespeare so as to avoid further barbarizing the language of Goethe. Of course, first my thanks to Eva, Indra, Janine, Alex, and all who made this possible. And my thanks to each of you for the honor of being able to share some thoughts with you today. And thank you for tolerating functioning in your second or third language so that I can use my native language. So as Indra said, in July of 1971, I started my first job working as a scientist doing research on the welfare of farm animals. It was the first position created in the University of Edinburgh, now the Scottish Rural College, for animal welfare. And my assignments included doing the first work on the welfare of sows in gestation stalls. That's the narrow stalls where sows were being kept throughout most of pregnancy, and on the growing practice for early weaning of piglets, weaning piglets at 3 weeks of age instead of the customary 6 weeks. So, as has been said, in July, I will finish exactly 50 years of working in this field, and I thought it was time to think back on what I have actually learned over the 50 years. And I'm going to raise 10 points. And if you do the arithmetic, you will realize that this is only learning one thing every 5 years, which makes me somewhat of a slow learner. However, please bear with me. First, I wanted to think about the shift that has happened in how we conceptualize our treatment of animals. When I started, the term animal welfare was actually quite unfamiliar. There, of course, had been concern about proper treatment of animals going back to the Bible, going back to the ancient Greeks. But in the English-speaking countries, this had been captured principally by the concept of cruelty. So in the early 1700s, social reformers trying to improve the moral tone of society saw cruelty as a kind of vice, along with drunkenness and dishonesty. And they wanted to stamp out this vice in order to improve society. And they saw cruelty to animals as a manifestation of this defect of human character. With that in mind, the English Parliament was actually willing to pass a law prohibiting acts of cruelty to animals, and they did that as early as 1822, at a time when very few people were actually concerned about the welfare of the animals, but really wanted to stamp out the vice of cruelty. And that remained the focus right through the 1800s. And in fact, most in English-speaking countries, most animal protection organizations that were formed were called not societies for the protection of animals, certainly not societies for the welfare of animals, but societies for the prevention of cruelty to animals. And that has persisted. Many of the major organizations in England and the other English-speaking countries have that rather long, complicated name because of this history. Then, in the mid-1900s, people's perception began to change. People began to see animals being used in quasi-industrial ways, highly institutionalized ways, in farm animal production, biomedical research, and so on. And the concern arose about how these artificial, semi-industrial ways of keeping animals would be affecting their quality of life. The word that came to be used to capture this new set of concerns was animal welfare. Now, initially, there wasn't complete agreement that this was the correct term. Farmers, for example, wanted to talk about animal care because that's what they did, and they looked upon animal welfare as the language of their critics. In the highly capitalistic United States of America, people were very reluctant to use the word welfare at all because it sounded like handouts to poor people and smacked of socialism. And so for a decade or two, when speaking to Americans on the subject, I had to be careful to speak about animal well-being. Well, I think some of this discussion about terms has now settled down, and people are quite comfortable using the term animal welfare as the main focus today, replacing the old focus simply on acts of cruelty. And one fine historian has published an interesting analysis of how, from about 1965 to 1975, the language of animal protection and the focus of animal protection changed. Right. Second thing I wanted to touch on is how science became involved in our understanding of animal welfare. And this had an interesting history. In 1964, a very effective activist named Ruth Harrison, a lifelong commitment to the cause of animals. She wrote a book called Animal Machines, describing the then new systems of quasi-industrial production of farm animals. It created a sensation in the United Kingdom, and the British government felt compelled to act. So they called a commission to investigate Ruth Harrison's claims about poor well-being in the animals in these systems. One of the members of the committee was an animal welfare researcher. He was a Quaker pacifist who had spent most of his life studying the bird song. And as part of the committee report, he wrote, just himself, an essay on how science could actually help us to understand the welfare of animals. And he described, for example, migratory birds in a cage, fluttering all night during the season of migration when they couldn't migrate. And he commented on how this, he believed, indicated a disturbed emotional state in the birds. He talked about a group of African buffalo that had to be relocated in a park in Africa. And after they had been transported, they were kept in a paddock, enclosed, for a few days before they were released. And every night, the buffalo came back and tried to get into the paddock. And he commented on how this must have seemed to the buffalo a much safer place to be in this fenced paddock close to human habitation than out in the wilds surrounded by lions and hyenas in the dark. And he used observations like that of animal behavior to argue that, yes, of course, veterinary medicine is important, stress physiology is important, and so on. But he emphasized how the study of animal behavior can actually give us insights into how to assess and improve the welfare of animals. In the early days, it was a little hard to explain to people, however, what I was doing. And if I said I was doing scientific research on animal welfare, sometimes people were simply baffled. Sometimes people actually thought I was joking. To many people, the only connection between animal welfare and science would be the suffering of animals in laboratories in biomedical research, and the idea of animal welfare science just seemed a kind of bizarre combination of words. It was our British colleague Marion Dawkins who was the most bold in declaring this to be a new field of science. In 1980, she published a book called Animal Suffering: The Science of Animal Welfare. And with Marion's bold lead, the rest of us felt, we actually have a field of science that we can talk about, and it actually has a name. Of course, as a field of science, it grew very slowly. There were maybe half a dozen of us doing research on animal welfare in the 1970s. We were publishing maybe 10 scientific papers per year, and of course, we would all read all of them. Recent survey indicated that now there are well over 1,000 scientific papers published per year on animal welfare. And of course, I've long since given up any hope of reading all of them. Unfortunately for me personally, the awareness of animal welfare as a field of science was slower to catch on in Canada and very slow to catch on in the United States. When we wanted to return to Canada in the 1970s for family reasons, having 2 young children, I remember writing to the Canadian government to say, here is a new emerging area of research. You should be investing some funds in supporting research in this area. And I received a very polite response, but of course, no action. So when we wanted to come back, I changed, or I thought I was changing. I wasn't really changing fields as much as I thought, and took a position as the provincial moose research biologist, studying what we call moose, what you call elk, in the boreal forest in Ontario. At that time, mostly when people did wildlife research, they were thinking of wildlife as a resource that they should try to conserve so that hunters will have lots of animals to shoot. Or perhaps in a more enlightened way, they were thinking about ecological systems that needed to be maintained for the benefit of the environment. But I, with my background in animal welfare, saw things a little differently. I saw the animals as individuals as well as a species, a population, a system. And in one case, we were able to identify these are secretive animals living deep in the forest that people see only occasionally. One of our studies, we actually were able to watch animals enough that we could identify individuals by characteristic markings year after year. And that actually proved very useful scientifically, because we could show them the differences between years and between seasons for the same individuals. It also caused me to see the animals as individuals because of the immense harm that was being done to them by some human activities. For example, I spent one summer trying to understand and subsequently helping to solve the problem of many, many road accidents involving moose in the spring and early summer. And we were able to actually show that a lot of this was due to residues of highway de-icing salt that had accumulated on the roadside and was extremely attractive to moose in the spring. Well, by 1981, the national government in Canada created its first position doing research on the behavior and welfare of farm animals, and it was just too much a temptation, and I moved to Ottawa and went back to the pigs and the cows and the sheep. Third thing I wanted to mention, so that was the emergence of science to deal with issues of animal welfare. The third thing I wanted to mention is the enormous change in public awareness of animal welfare as an issue. I'm sure you've all had this experience yourselves of seeing animal welfare in the news as a topic for governments and so on. But let me just give a simple personal example. In 1997, when a young colleague and I went to the University of British Columbia to start the university's first academic program of research and teaching in animal welfare, we started an undergraduate course on animal welfare, and 20 students enrolled. And I think the university administrators were rather relieved to see that there was at least some student interest in this new subject. A few years later, we started a second course called Animals and Society, which was about the use of animals in food production, companionship, biomedical research, and so on. And again, 20 students enrolled. To cut a long story short, the enrollments grew to the point where we had to move the Animals and Society class into a much larger room. We capped it at 120, but there was still far more demand than that. So we added 2 other sections. So we now have 3 sections of that course taught throughout the year. And we've also added almost 10 courses in animal welfare, one on horse health and welfare, one on laboratory animals, one on companion animals, one on animal welfare and conservation, and so on. So I just mentioned that. Here is a roughly 20-year period when we grew from having 20 students with an interest to the point where actually the fact that our university has so much activity in animal welfare is actually a drawing card that brings students to the university for that purpose. Fourth point, I wanted to talk about how animal welfare has increased as an area of policy involving more and more players. When casting our minds back, the British Parliament was willing to pass that law about cruelty to animals in 1822, but no one seemed very interested in enforcing it, including the police. And this was actually why the first Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was created, to actually have some enforcement for this new law. And that persisted right through for many decades, and in fact still into the present. So in my own province of British Columbia, almost all animal protection enforcement work is done by constables hired by the SPCA, who are not police and not government employees. That was the first step, where the major actor was the charitable sector. I think starting in the 1970s, we saw governments taking a more active role. For example, the British government commissioned and organized the writing of codes of practice for the welfare of farm animals during the 1970s. Canada followed suit about 10 years later. These were not regulations, but it showed a degree of government involvement. In the 1980s, I think particularly in that decade, we began to see governments taking a more active role in actual legislation. One example being the law in 1988 in Sweden, whereby Sweden forbade the use of things like stalls for sows and cages for hens, and required that adult dairy cows be let out on pasture in the summer. This, if you don't happen to know the story, was very much the doing of Astrid Lindgren, the writer of the Pippi Longstocking stories. Astrid Lindgren was, I think it's fair to say, Sweden's best known and best loved citizen at the time. And when she took up the cause of farm animal welfare, no government could resist. Another example like Ruth Harrison, of the dedicated activist, well-informed and highly, highly effective. Right, so in the 1980s, numerous national governments actually brought in laws for the protection of animal welfare. It's a little simplistic to just go by decades, but I would say the 1990s, we particularly saw the involvement of major corporations. I remember a phone call toward the end of the 1990s from a hamburger restaurant, one of the big international fast food restaurant chains, who had their headquarters in Florida. I was a little skeptical of this telephone call saying that this fast food restaurant wanted to become involved in setting animal welfare standards, but I reluctantly agreed to go to their first meeting. Now, Canadians often go to Florida in order to escape the winter. Younger people go for 2 weeks for a holiday. Older people may go for 3 or 4 months. We call them the snowbirds who fly away during the Canadian winter. I had always prided myself in being a Canadian who had never once gone to Florida. I also am not a fan of fast food restaurants. So when I had to say to my friends that I was going to Florida to meet with a fast food restaurant company, well, it was a little humbling. What I found was that although many of the large corporations were talking about animal welfare, for some of them it was more about public relations, but some were dead earnest. And I had the pleasure of working with a couple who were clearly committed to making progress in this area, using their corporate influence to make progress. One of the things they did, there were 3 companies who independently sent their own inspectors to the slaughter plants where their products were coming from. One of my colleagues in doing all this work was Temple Grandin, well known for her work in animal welfare advocacy and advocacy for autistic people, Temple herself being having had autism throughout her life. And Temple, with this enormous experience of slaughter plants, I don't know how she does it, said, in her opinion, the inspections by these chain restaurant companies had done more in 1 year than many years of government veterinary inspection had done to improve the welfare of animals in those plants. So there, I would, all right, so that brings us up to about the year 2000. And in the early 2000s, we started to see another group of players, major international agencies becoming involved. Indra already mentioned the World Organization for Animal Health, sometimes called the OIE because of its original name in French, the Office International des Epizooties. World Organization for Animal Health, headquarters in Paris, currently has about 180 member countries. Almost all the countries of the world are involved. It was formed in 1924 to prevent the international spread of infectious diseases, but in 2000 or 2001, the member countries voted to expand their mandate to include the creation of global standards for animal welfare. And over the next 15 years, we were able to create over 100 pages of animal welfare standards in their standard book of the Terrestrial Animal Health Code. Now, these are not revolutionary standards. They're very basic. As you could expect if 180 countries are going to agree to them. But at least they give, for example, veterinary officials in some of the world's poorer countries a leg to stand on when they want to achieve improvements in slaughter plants, farm animal management, animal transportation, and so on. Indra also mentioned the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which convened an expert committee on how to incorporate animal welfare into their programs of agricultural development. So just thinking back over that history, in the early days, we saw mainly animal protection charities as the driving force, then governments, then major international corporations, and then international agencies with most of the world's countries as their members. Just a remarkable shift in policy setting and involvement in the issues. It has been remarkable to see this throughout my 50 years. Another change that I have seen is in the sophistication of people's thinking about animal welfare. In the early days, we often heard the argument, especially from farmers and veterinarians, that animal welfare is so tied to the health and productivity of animals that all we need to do is make sure that they are growing quickly, reproducing quickly, producing lots of milk and eggs, and that by itself is enough to demonstrate that their welfare must be in a good state. Well, of course, people quickly realize that this is far, far too simple. The argument does apply in very poor cases where animals are, for example, sick or malnourished, underfed, poorly housed, and solving those very basic problems of animal welfare will, of course, improve their productivity. But in many cases, we are dealing with very high levels of productivity where, for example, by breeding and feeding dairy cows for very high milk production, it is actually causing metabolic disorders. It can be detrimental to their health. Breeding hens for very high egg production has led to premature osteoporosis because so much calcium is being taken for eggshell formation that it's being taken away from their bones. So in many cases, we are pushing the limits of productivity to the point where it is negatively correlated with animal welfare, not positively correlated. Well, as this realization set in, many scientists started to look for alternative measures. If it isn't just about productivity and growth and how many eggs you produce in a year, what would be some other ways of, quote, measuring animal welfare? And there were various proposals. The problem was that different scientists would propose different measures that often conflicted. And I remember one famous case where two groups of scientists, one in Europe, one in Australia, both studied the welfare of sows in gestation stalls, those narrow stalls where sows were kept during pregnancy and couldn't walk or turn around. And one group, using one set of criteria for animal welfare, concluded that there is no way to make these appropriate for animal welfare. The other group, using different criteria, concluded that there was no welfare problem with these stalls. So that was the kind of confusion that we saw in science, not uncommonly, leading up to about the year 2000. I think now the solution has been the following realization: that animal welfare is not a technical term like atomic weight, that scientists can simply define in a way that makes it possible for them to measure it. Animal welfare is a word that is in the public domain, that people use it in public debate about how animals should be treated, to express their concerns about the quality of life of animals. And so scientists must listen to the public and understand what the term means in its public meaning. And I think the answer is roughly three things. For some people, the main concern is, of course, that animals should function well. They should be healthy, well fed, well housed, and so on. And this is traditionally the view of farmers and many veterinarians. To other people, the key concern is that animals should feel well, in the sense of not experiencing excessive pain, fear, hunger, and being able to enjoy life. And this has traditionally been more the concern of the animal protection movement. Thirdly, many people are concerned that animals should be able to lead a reasonably natural life, a life that suits their own natures. This is a little harder to get our mind around, and sometimes it's been interpreted too simplistically. So, for example, this does not simply mean that animals should be in an environment that looks nice and natural to us. For hens, for example, these are descendants of a jungle-dwelling species, which evolved in an environment with lots of trees. If hens are let out of doors into a great open field, they tend to stay indoors most of the time. But if there are trees outside, then they will go out and cluster under the trees. So here we need to use again our observations of animal behavior in order to understand what actually is a welcoming environment, a natural environment for a species. So with that realization that animal welfare is about ensuring that animals function well, that they feel well, and that they can live a life according to their own nature. This then helps us resolve some of the old conflicts, but it also complicates things because sometimes a particular way of raising animals may look good by one criterion, that the animals are, for example, healthy, but poor by another criterion, they may be very constrained in their actions. And so the task of animal welfare science is not simply to measure animal welfare in some unitary way, but rather to find ways of balancing these different concerns and come up with good systems of dealing with animals that allow them a sensible balance of functioning well, feeling well, and being able to live lives according to their own natures. Sixth point, about the use of science. I talked about animals feeling well. I want to think for a moment about the use of science to understand the feelings and emotions of animals. And here I'll probably use the term affective state. So, touch is a feeling, but it isn't necessarily pleasant or unpleasant. An affective state is something we experience that is either positive or pleasant or unpleasant, rather than neutral. So this includes many emotions like fear, pain, and fear and pain, but it also includes things like hunger that we wouldn't call an emotion, but that is clearly an affective state. I'm just going to ask, there is some noise going on outside, and I'm going to close my window. I'm not sure if you can hear some buzzing going on, some construction. I'm going to close my window so that that won't be a distraction. One moment. Good. Let's hope that helps. When I was a student of animal behavior in the 1960s, we were taught that science cannot be used to understand emotions, feelings, the affective states of animals. Because, one, we can't observe them directly, and two, animals can't report them to us the way human subjects in an experiment could do. But if animal welfare is strongly focused, if one of the key components of animal welfare is how animals feel, then clearly we need to have science to help us understand these affective states of animals. There still is some debate about this, but I think it is largely settled using the following logic. Science often advances our knowledge about things that we can't observe directly. And it does so by postulating a situation, creating predictions based on that postulate, and then testing the predictions. So, for example, if scientists postulate that there is a black hole in a particular part of the universe, of course we can't see it. But if it is there, then we can predict that the other stars and galaxies around it should behave in a certain way, and we can test those predictions. And if the predictions turn out to be right, time and time again, that increases our confidence that the original idea of the black hole being there is correct. And we can do very much the same kind of thing with the experiences, the affective states of animals. For example, if we see an animal limping, we might ask, is this because simply of a mechanical problem with a joint, or is it actually in pain? Well, if we postulate that the animal is in pain, then we could clear up the problem by giving it an analgesic, and it should limp less. Even more sophisticatedly, we could offer animals two kinds of water, one fresh water and one water with a bad tasting analgesic in it. Those who are in pain, the ones that we see limping, we would predict would gradually learn to drink some of the bad tasting water because it helps them feel better, whereas those that aren't limping should stick with the fresh water. And exactly this kind of prediction does work out. So in this way, although we can't directly observe or hear from animals about their emotional states, we can build up a good understanding using the tools of science for these affective states of animals. As a student, I was told that any talk of emotions in animals was simply anthropomorphism, simply projecting human feelings onto animals. It is so far from that. Here's an example. With my work on moose, I came to realize that they are extraordinarily attracted to sources of sodium salt in the spring and early summer. So here's an animal on a strictly vegetarian diet, eating leaves and twigs, well, in the winter, only twigs, which have almost no sodium, and so they're on a very, very, very low sodium diet. Along comes the spring green-up, and all these leaves come out. They are much richer as a food, but also much richer in potassium, so that the body's sodium-potassium balance, which is already precarious, is thrown completely off. And at this point, they become so attracted to any sources of sodium salt that they will walk for miles through the forest, remembering where they found a source of salt in a previous year. And of course, that also attracts them to our highways with the residues of highway de-icing salt. So here I had to postulate that the animal was experiencing a craving for salt, which I myself have never experienced. So this is very far from anthropomorphism. I am not projecting onto animals a feeling that I have had. I am having to imagine that these animals have a feeling that is completely foreign to me. Right. Seventh point about, quote, good lives for animals. in the early stages of concern about animal welfare, the focus was pretty much on negative states like fear, pain, and hunger. Now we're hearing much more talk about providing animals with positive welfare or allowing animals to have good lives. This isn't, I would say this is not really something new. I think for all of us, the idea of comfort, contentment, and enjoyment, these were always an integral part of animal welfare right from the beginning. But if you have problems of fear, pain, serious frustration, and so on, clearly I think the animal wants those cleared up as a priority. But as we make that kind of progress, how do we turn our mind to animals, to detecting states like enjoyment and pleasure in animals? And here's the logic that I think works. I think we have been built, we people have been built with two kinds of motivation to motivate behavior. Where there is some need with some degree of urgency, it is to some extent time dependent. For example, we are getting dehydrated and need water. There is some looming danger that we need to escape from quite quickly. Under those conditions, we have these negative states like thirst and fear that are so characteristic that we give them individual names. We have specific names for them. However, when those urgent or semi-urgent situations have been dealt with, there are lots of things we can do that are probably beneficial in the long term, like learning, developing skills through play, developing social relations through, in the human case, talking. For animals, it might be social grooming. And these are activities that aren't driven by the same negative state that we can say, oh, I am so hungry to go out and learn something. We don't have specific words for them the way we have for the negative feelings, but those are enjoyable activities. And so we're built to deal with urgent problems by confronting our negative states. And then when that's been dealt with reasonably well, we can do other beneficial things that cause us enjoyment. My own experience of mammals and birds tells me that those species are also built with this same combination. And that we often see animals and birds doing things that aren't necessary at a particular time. Exploring, learning, social grooming, renewing territorial boundaries, excitedly storing food when the nuts mature on a particular tree. And these things are often done in a way that suggests a high level of excitement and enjoyment. So I think if we want to understand states like enjoyment in animals, what we need to do is watch for animals doing things that aren't needed at a particular time, but that are natural for the species and that they do with this kind of with what looks like a positive affect. I wanted to end with 3 areas that I think need much more attention than we've given them in the past. And the first of these is genetics. I think genetics is one of the significant causes of animal welfare problems and a largely untapped way of solving them. So, for example, breeding animals, I mentioned this before, breeding animals for extreme production traits like high egg production, very lean carcasses, this often brings with it some kind of metabolic or other disorder. Whereas, if we could breed animals for resistance to disease, we could have animals that were naturally more healthy and we could also reduce our dependence on the use of antibiotics to treat sick animals. I think breeding companion animals for extreme appearance traits falls into the same category. Thinking, for example, of the British Bulldog with its brachycephalic skull, causing difficulties in breathing to the point that it may pass out at times of exercise. We had an old collie, a rough collie, who really did not see well. And this made me interested in the phenomenon of collie eye anomaly. And I found that it was present in the 1950s and 60s at a very low rate in the rough collie breed. But over the years, breeding animals for appearance traits, particularly for show purposes, led to some extreme breeding and some inbreeding. And now practically every rough collie in North America has the genetics for collie eye anomaly, although in some cases it's less expressed than others. And then at the same time, genetics gives us lots of opportunities to improve animal welfare. I mentioned breeding animals for disease resistance. I'm encouraged to see the crossbreeding of breeds particularly of dogs, where the buildup of deleterious recessive genes that's happened in purebreds through inbreeding is then solved by some judicious crossbreeding. I think that's a good development. And here's a controversial one. Cattle naturally have a hornless gene, but it's only in a very small percentage of the animals of certain breeds. We could, by gene editing, cause all cattle in a relatively short time of say, the Holstein cattle widely used in the world's milk production. We could insert the gene for hornlessness so that, one, the animals can't injure each other with horns, and two, as an alternative, don't need to experience the painful procedure of cauterization or horn removal. Of course, this is controversial because it's gene editing, but this is not bringing in a foreign gene into the species. It is actually just making sure that each of these animals has a gene that naturally occurs in the species. That, if we could do that, I think we could make a major improvement in the welfare of dairy cows. That was my three final points of areas for improvement. Second area for improvement, I want to call this the human dimension of animal welfare. When we have created animal welfare standards up till now, they've mostly been about the environment that animals are kept in. That sows shouldn't be in small stalls, how much space pigs should have in their pens, the air quality in a barn, and so on. But whenever we do a survey study of a large number of farms, all using the same animal welfare standards, what we find is enormous variation in some really basic welfare outcomes, things like the amount of lameness, the amount of emaciation, the amount of aggression. And why is this? I think the answer is we haven't paid enough attention to the human dimension, the fact that the care that the animals receive in these systems is a major factor in achieving good welfare. One of the best examples, one of the best worked examples is the research by Paul Hemsworth and colleagues in Australia, who've shown that if animals are handled in an unpleasant way, it creates sort of chronic fear of people. And since, particularly in a farm situation, animals are always exposed to some extent to people, that chronic fear has implications for their health, their growth, productivity, and so on. Beyond that, we've got some interesting hints. One study by Marion Dawkins of many, many chicken flocks found that the better welfare outcomes happened where there were only 1 or 2 workers looking after a flock, not a rotating cast of several, and where they checked the birds 5 times a day instead of only once or twice. So here was attentiveness and consistency, because it was the same people doing it, that added up to create a better welfare situation. In a study of clouded leopards in zoos, some zoos have the philosophy that these are wild animals and we should minimize their time with human exposure. So keepers should keep away from, do the basics, but not spend too much time near the animals. Other zoos take the opposite philosophy. A study of stress responses in clouded leopards showed that the animals were much less stressed in those zoos where the keepers spent a lot of time nearby, in a completely unthreatening, reassuring way, talking to the cats, reassuring them, and in this way the clouded leopards developed a certain comfort around people that got them through a life in a zoo with much less stress than in those ones where the keepers had a kind of hands-off approach. And in a study of dairy farms done long ago, old colleague Martin Seabrook concluded that the best person to look after dairy cows is what he called a confident introvert. So this is not a talkative person who will use a loud voice and speak flamboyantly and make gestures, but also not a timid person, comfortable moving around cows, but not flamboyant. And Martin pointed out that this is not necessarily the kind of person you want to invite to your party, this confident introvert. A confident introvert is not necessarily popular with people, but they are very popular with cows. Well, there are just some tantalizing examples to show that I think if we could pay more attention to how human actions, conscientiousness, consistency, personality, as well as some basic handling. I think if we could pay more attention to these human dimensions of animal welfare, we could make some real progress. And finally, I want to go back to the moose and talk about animal welfare in relation to conservation. I think if we look at what aspects of human behavior have affected the non-human inhabitants of the planet the most, I think we have to point to the technology of the 20th century as the most harmful to the non-human inhabitants of the planet. And let me just give a few examples. During the 20th century, we developed complicated communication systems, often with tall towers. In the 1950s, with the advent of television, we started using, at least in North America, some very tall communication towers. The best studied of these is documented to have killed over 100,000 birds. What happens is these are mainly night flying migrants, so birds that naturally migrate in dense flocks at night, guided by the stars. And on cloudy nights where they can't see the stars, the lights on these towers disorient them, and the birds fly around in a confused way until they collide with usually one of the cables holding the tower up. They may break a wing, flutter to the ground, where they will die. So here was the best documented tower, has killed more than 100,000 birds known, and goodness knows how many unknown. We now have at least 75,000 communication towers in North America. undoubtedly killing many, many millions of birds per year. Windows. Before the 20th century, most window glass came in panes about this big. And if you wanted a large window, you assembled a number of panes in some kind of structure made of wood or metal, and that structure allowed birds to perceive, mostly, that this was something solid that they shouldn't fly into. 20th century technology allowed us to create large plates of glass for picture windows in homes, and now, of course, massive office towers completely clad in glass. My old friend Daniel Clem, his career has been almost exactly corresponding to mine. He has studied the problem of birds colliding with windows for nearly 50 years. He's concluded that in North America alone, at least 1 billion birds are injured or killed by windows per year, and the number must be billions worldwide. In agriculture, we have seen, 20th century technology has seen, very heavy agricultural equipment used on fields. This has meant that we need much larger fields, and it's completely changed the rural habitat for animals. But it also has had a drastic effect on burrowing rodents. Almost certainly, we are killing billions of burrowing rodents per year through plowing, especially plowing, but also other forms of soil tillage. Transportation. 20th century revolutionized our transportation system to this extreme dependence on the use of cars. Colleagues in the US in the late 1900s looked at the evidence and concluded that in America alone, cars must kill about 1 million vertebrate animals per day, and that in the 1990s, cars overtook hunting as the leading direct human cause of terrestrial vertebrates. Pollution, of course, plastics in the ocean, nutrient loading of other waters has disrupted aquatic systems and killed unimaginable numbers of animals and altered habitat for many more. And then, of course, the technologies of the 20th century are releasing so much carbon into the environment that they're changing the climate of the planet, and that this may be the greatest effect of them all. We tend to think of these as conservation issues. And people talk about how this will affect the extinction of species, the reduction of populations, or the integrity of ecological systems. But of course, these are also animal welfare problems of the first order. Daniel Clem concluded that when birds fly into windows, some die quickly, but many more are injured. They break a beak and can't eat. They hit their head and develop a subdural hematoma that kills them in pain over the next few days. These are problems of animal welfare as well as conservation. They are affecting individual animals just as they are affecting species and systems and populations. Two conclusions. One is that we need a new ethic for animals, one that incorporates not only our intentional effects through our diet, medical testing, hunting, food production, and so on, but also includes the things we don't intend to do, may not even know about, that are also having a profound effect on the welfare of animals. Second conclusion, that the animal welfare movement and the conservation movement, which have traditionally been fairly separate, sometimes even at war with each other, these two movements need to recognize that in many cases, it is the same underlying problem that is causing a problem of conservation or a problem of animal welfare, and the two movements need to work much more in collaboration. Those are the 10 things I have learned in 50 years. Do your arithmetic and you will find that I am a slow learner, and I am sure that the rest of you are learning much more quickly than that. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you, David, very, very much for this very, very interesting talk. And I'm pretty sure that you learned a lot more in those 50 years. But probably we would sit here until, I don't know, next Christmas if you shared all your learnings and experiences with us. So thank you very much for this very, very good lecture and this insight into your 50 years, your experience in animal welfare science. We have some questions. So I'm happy to start with one question. So one participant is writing, first of all, very interesting talk, thank you. And then a question regarding the example of clouded leopards. Would you, in general, encourage a closer contact to animals instead the hands-off approach in zoos or wildlife sanctuaries to improve their well-being and reduce stress levels?
Yeah, great question. I asked myself that also. To me, it was slightly counterintuitive that the zoos that had the most contact had the lowest stress levels. I think we would need to study it species by species. But in the case of the clouded leopards, it looked quite decisive that having this reassuring contact with animals was really, really positive. One other, let me think, there was one other example with some of the small cats. So ocelot, savanna cat, the various species of small cats in zoos. And in this case, all they were looking at was the success of breeding. But in fact, they also found that where the cats had a lot of exposure to people, but friendly, unthreatening exposure to people, that they got the best outcomes. So I don't think we should overgeneralize, but I think we should treat it as an open question for a given species and keep that possibility in mind. Yeah?
Okay, thank you very much. So we have another question about horns. Horns are important for the communication between cows, as we all know. Do you really think it would be beneficial for the welfare of cows if they all would be polled? Would it be better if the environment of the cows was adapted to them having horns?
Okay, they're perfect. Yes, of course. If cows are being raised in a way where there is no chance of them injuring each other or people with their horns, of course, agreed. Unfortunately, I'm living in a part of the world where the average dairy herd has over 150 cows. I'm not too far from California, where there are many herds with thousands of cows. The reality of economics in much of the world is that we are going to have cows in these environments where there is a real danger. And so under those conditions, until we can solve those underlying problems, people feel that they need to remove the horns, and with justification for the conditions that they have. So yes, the questioner is asking about a more perfect world where we don't need to take horns off cows at all. In our less perfect world where the balance of harms and benefits makes us take horns off cows, it would be better for them to not have them than to have to remove them.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one more question, or a few more, sorry. Wow, there are so many questions popping up, so I'm getting a bit confused in the chat window. Thank you for this wonderful talk again. Considering the importance of the human dimension, how do you see automatization, okay, got it, and digitalization in livestock farming? Is it more an opportunity or rather a challenge for animal welfare? what do we have to pay special attention to regarding this development?
Okay.
Two
First of all,
sentences, no.
yeah, I am just going to flag that this is a profound question. And I think basically we don't know. What we would need, for example, is good comparisons of herds, for example, a herd of dairy cows that is being managed through robotic milkers versus herds that are being managed with more human contact. We have just so much to learn about that. I think it is probably we can probably achieve good welfare outcomes in either system. In the more automated system, we have to be very careful that the technology, the challenges are different. In the systems with a lot of human contact, we know now some of the things that need to be done to improve the quality of the contact. The newer, more automated systems, there hasn't been enough research done on the welfare of animals in them that we can make really strong conclusions. But I would just second the question, agree with the question, that this is something we need to be asking.
Okay. So more work to do, huh? So once more, thank you for the interesting lecture. Shifting the focus from animal welfare to animal rights. How long do you think will this process need to last? Another 50 years?
It is, okay, again, yes, I think it needs to last at least another 50 years. I think it will take at least another 50 years. In some cases, I think we can already use the rights concept in very constructive ways. That, for example, companion animals have a right to not be so genetically changed that they are unhealthy. Maybe we can use some basic rights language for achieving some things now. If what the questioner means is how soon will we eliminate all use of animals in human society, I think, well, my old colleague Tom Reagan wrote the book The Case for Animal Rights in 1984, published in 1984, arguing that the commercial production of animals for food should cease completely. Every year since the publication of Tom's book, the amount of meat consumption in the world has reached a new record level. Yeah. So from the first articulation of the animal rights, but from that very formal articulation of the animal rights argument that commercial agriculture should cease, the world has gone in exactly the opposite direction. I guess like the people watching epidemiology, we need to watch the shape of the curve, but it is not encouraging at this point for the world adopting an animal rights view. So those of us regretfully trying to solve the animal welfare problems that are there in current real life systems, there will be a need for us to continue for a very long time, maybe forever.
Yeah, because I mean, do you think that there might be a chance, like in many, many, many years, that this shift will happen at all? Or is it just two different approaches, two different areas?
Yeah. Okay. I think there will be I think there will be a significant reduction in per capita animal product consumption over the next few decades at least in the wealthy countries that are currently making very heavy use of animal production. Mm-hmm. Most of the increase in essentially, the rich countries have pretty much plateaued, but at a very high level of meat consumption. The increase in the world is being driven by increasing prosperity in countries like, well, China, for example, but not only China. However, so per capita meat consumption, last time I looked in China, had got up to in the 60 kilometers per person per year. America, that is roughly similar to, say, the Czech Republic. America is more like 120 kilograms of meat per person per year. This is pathological. You know, we know that this is simply unhealthy even for the consumer, not just for the planet, for the animals, and so on. So I think that will come down, and it's been plateauing. The increase in global meat consumption has been driven largely by increasing prosperity in formerly less prosperous countries. The prosperous countries have plateaued. I think in the prosperous countries, it will come down through education and the creation, which I'm seeing now in great amount, the creation of alternative products that people are using that to their taste really do replace traditional meat. So I'm quite enthusiastic about that. I also think that the environmental concerns about ruminants producing methane and so on, I think that will also figure into the human. Okay, I'm being incoherent. I think that the combination of knowledge of how high consumption affects human health and how our huge production of animal products affects the environment, combined with the coming on stream of alternative products, I think those three things will bring per capita meat consumption down in the rich countries. At the same time, we may expect to see continued increase in meat consumption in the currently less rich countries as they become more prosperous, if and as. But let's also think about India, where meat consumption per capita is 4 kilograms per person per year. Yeah? So here is a cultural factor that is causing India to be completely contrary to the rest of the trends of the world. So there is hope for culture after all.
Yes. Wow, 4 kilograms. That's, if I think about Austria, we have 65 kilograms per year, which is obviously half than in the USA, as I just learned from you. But still, I mean, just imagine, that's such an amount.
However, but it has to be said, they do make very heavy use of milk products. Yeah. So they don't slaughter relatively little meat consumption, but they are still quite dependent on animals for protein foods because they're using it through dairy production. They're very, very big producers of milk.
Good. So at this time I have one more question to ask, and okay, one more question I will ask, then another one from a participant that she would like to ask herself, and then another one that I will read out. So just to give you an idea of how we proceed. So question is, what's your opinion on zoos? Are they still appropriate in these times? Is it still like a contemporary concept?
Okay, another great question, and I ask myself that a lot. Being a practical person, I would put it this way. They range from ones that should be shut down immediately to ones that I think can justify, the way they're doing things can justify their continued existence because of, one, they're not taking animals that are, they're being selective about what species they house. I think some species can thrive in a zoo environment and others absolutely cannot. And one of the proudest moments for me, I'm on an advisory board for the zoo in Detroit. They actually have an animal welfare section in the zoo staff, a humane education program, and so on. They have polar bears, but their polar bears were orphan polar bears that needed a good home. And honestly, I would far sooner, just personally, I would rather that these polar bears had this nice environment in the Detroit Zoo with very rich swimming and pleasant environment than that they would have been killed as surplus bears. At the same time, they decided that their climate was completely unsuitable for elephants, and so they decided to never have elephants again, and they moved their existing elephants to a warm sanctuary somewhere else. So I think there is an example of a zoo which is being selective about what species it has, being selective about the source. These are not anything wild caught or even, in the case of the polar bears, not even wild bred. It's more like a rescue situation. And third, being very attentive to the environment that they're providing. So when you see those conditions met, I'm enthusiastic. How often are those conditions met? Not often.
No enthusiasm anymore about that, right? Yeah. Okay, so now we have two last questions. So one question is from Mrs. Meyer, Rosalie Meyer. She's unmuted now and can ask herself. And then I will ask the last one for you.
Good.
Hello. I'm Maria, and this is my best friend Rosalie. And we wanted to thank you for these great stories and interesting facts. We'd have two questions for you. Okay, would you like to start? Okay. The first question is, what's your favorite experience with being an animal welfare expert?
Oh, that is the hardest question I've ever been asked. I don't know how to choose. Okay. I think my favorite was getting to know some pigs so well that they looked at me as a friend. And they would run up to me. So these are farm animals. And generally speaking, they had a not friendly relationship. They tolerated people, but they were handled sometimes a little roughly. But when they saw me, they would come up to me so I would pet them. And with pigs, it's a little bit like dogs, but much more extreme. They love to have their bellies rubbed. And so pigs would come up to me and lie down and turn their belly up so that I would rub their bellies. And I think that was my absolute favorite, that they trusted me and liked me that much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is, what is your favorite fact that you learned throughout these years?
Okay. Because I was taught that we can't really use science to understand the emotions of animals, I think the thing I'm happiest about, and it's sort of not exactly a fact, but it's more a realization that we really can use science to understand states in animals like enjoyment and comfort and contentment. I think that's the thing that I have found most interesting. Yeah. And thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much for your questions. Those were the hardest questions I've been asked for a long time. That was wonderful.
We really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I think I see 2 future students, David. Yeah, very good. I really like it that they left you speechless for a few seconds at least. Very good questions, Rosalie and Marion. So last question I would like to ask. Some philosophers predict that in 20 years, industrial animal farming will be almost zero because clean, cultured meat will flow the market instead, market for meat. What do you think of this prediction?
Yeah, good. I would say it will depend very much on the culture and the country that we're talking about. So I do think that there will be a very significant increase in use of non-animal alternatives in the richer countries where these are readily available and where people are technically sophisticated. And maybe also, very educated about animal welfare, animal rights, and the environment. At the same time, I think this process will be much, much slower in the countries that are still prioritizing getting their poorest people out of extreme poverty, getting basic health care for their poor communities, and so on. So I think the answer will be very different, essentially, for the rich countries and the poor countries of the world.
Okay. Good. So, David, you talked a lot now. I hope you enjoyed it at least as much as we did. I know for you it's very normal to talk about all these topics and to talk about your experiences last years. But for us, I think I can speak for all of the participants as far as I read in the chat already what they said and how happy the people were to listen to you, to have the chance to listen to you. Yeah, I think I speak for all of us when I say that this was really, really, really a great experience, a great lecture. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And I would like to make one last remark. Unfortunately, not interesting for you because you are in Canada, but for all our Austrian participants, the Tierschutzombudsstelle has 2 brochures about animal products, about milk and pork. Yeah, sorry, I'm just confused already. So milk and pork. So if you are interested to find out as a consumer what animal welfare standards are met or not met when you go shopping in the supermarket, you can find out here. And you can find these brochures online on our website, www.tieranwalt.at, or you just contact us and order them and we will send them to you. So thank you. Yeah.
Let me just say my own thanks to all of you and to all the participants today. It was a great opportunity to speak with you and hear the questions. Very nice from my end as well. So thank you very much.
Perfect. We're happy to hear that. And David, would be very nice if you could stay online and don't hang up right away. Okay, so thank you to all our participants online, and I hope, we will have the chance to meet in person one day again. First time and again, So thank you so much. Have a great evening, all of you, wherever you are. And Eva is coming.
Bye-bye from me as well.
And yeah, it was good to see you all. Bye.